Protagoras and the Sophists, okay? So this is one of the more important ones to understand. We've had to lay the foundation with Heraclitus first, and now we're going to hit Protagoras and the Sophists, and then build off of this. And this is going to kind of introduce the tension. So Heraclitus is kind of like, oh, that's kind of good. I mean, we listen to that as Christians. We're like, yes, we kind of like Heraclitus. And then all of a sudden we read this, and it's going to say, oh, this is where things are going off the rail, okay? So Protagoras, okay? Protagoras. Remember Heraclitus. He believed that there is one logos uniting the many changing things in the world into a single world order. But what about the Sophists? The Sophists came a bit after Heraclitus, but they did not point to the logos as the measure of all things. Rather, they pointed to mankind as the measure of all things. So now before we unpack this assertion, it's important for us to note that the Sophists consider themselves as modern thinkers. This is kind of humorous. They thought of themselves as modern thinkers. They saw themselves as individuals representing progress and enlightenment rather than what? Ignorance and superstition. So this would have been the group of people that would have said, you know, we're not backwards like what grandpa and grandma. We're progressive. We're the cutting edge. We're going to make progress into this new enlightened world. So they had basically pride, we'll say it that way, pride in their own view of how they viewed the world, okay, obviously, okay? So they viewed individuals like Heraclitus and others with ignorance and superstition. Loosely stated, the Sophists can be viewed as those who opposed Heraclitus's view of one objective logos. The Sophists' equally persuasive logoses can be formed on multiple sides of every issue. Okay, let me explain to you what that means. For the Sophists, equally persuasive logoses can be formed on multiple sides of every issue. Okay, so for the Sophists then, they would basically say that you can actually have a logos, but this person A and this person B, they can have equally formed logoses to back their opinion. And so they would reject one objective, unifying logos. That makes sense? So it really shifts to more individualism. So this introduces Protagoras. And Protagoras is famous because he's one of the many Sophists, but he's the most famous for this line that he actually quotes. So he's a leading Sophist, and he's most famous for this line: man is the measure of all things, of those that are, that they are, of those that are not, that they are not. One more time. Man is the measure of all things, of those that are, that they are, that those that are not, they are not. So this sentiment is the father, we would say the father of the modern saying, okay, loosely stated, what is true for me is true for me. What is true for you is true for you. Okay? You've heard that before. In other words, Protagoras and the Sophists believe that there are no criteria, no standards, or marks by which to judge laws, ethics, and so forth, except for us. And so what they would say is this is to summarize what they're saying. They say you cannot jump outside of ourselves to see how things look independently of yourself. Okay? Now, does this sound familiar? Yep, it should sound extremely familiar. The way that I've phrased it is this, is that what we have in the American culture and Western civilization right now is neo-sophist. Neo means new. Neo-sophist. There's nothing new under the sun. So what the academic individuals who are promoting relativism in our culture right now, they are just what? The Sophists reincarnate, if you will, if you want to say it that way, or neo-sophists. They are resurrecting an old ideology. Nothing new. Nothing new. And what I found very, very interesting is that the ancient Sophists thought of themselves as being progressive and enlightened. kind of humorous, it should make you smile, okay? Okay, so let's keep on. We've got to plow a little bit harder here, and then we'll pull the throttle back. Now, there's a disagreement among philosophers as to whether Protagoras meant that mankind is the individual person or the collective whole. So when we say up at the top there, man is the measure of all things. When he says that man is the measure of all things, is he saying man as in what? A collective whole of humans? Or is he saying the individual man? So there's a dispute among some. They debate on that, how to understand that. But regardless of which interpretation is accepted, the fact remains that Protagoras and the Sophists represent what is called relativism. Relativism simply states that according to Protagoras, okay, this is going to paraphrase Protagoras, whatever practice seems right and laudable to any particular state are so for that state so long as it holds by them. In other words, if North Dakota has a law stating rioting is wrong, now I'm going to take a shot actually at Minnesota here. In other words, if North Dakota has a law stating rioting is wrong, and Minnesota has a law saying rioting is fine, a person abiding by relativism could not say North Dakota's law is true and Minnesota's law is false. The only thing that a person could say is that one law may be sounder or more useful and beneficial than the other. That's all you can say, according to relativism and this Protagorean thought. In summary, there's no way to tell if North Dakota's logos is better than Minnesota's logos. The logos may be different and may differ from state to state. It may differ from culture to culture. It may differ from time to time, and even from individual to individual. But what seems to be true for one person or state at one time may not seem true to another. You see the dilemma here? Okay, this is actually very, now I'm going to go off script here a little bit. This affects, and I'm going to be pulling from Dr. Gregory Schultz, who talks about this, is if I have a logos here, and let's just say George has a logos over here, and then the way that I use and understand words, that words themselves, if I adjust the words to accommodate for my logos, and he has his words and he uses his words to accommodate for his logos per se, then how can we communicate? How can we relate? You can't. For those online, somebody asked, is this kind of like marriage? I'm not going to go there. But you see what I'm saying? It becomes very fundamentally difficult. And what we'll arrive at, too, at the conclusion then, is if George has his perception of logos and I have my perception of logos, and what is true for him is true for him, what's true for me is true for me, then ultimately what we end up doing, the only way then to move forward, because we can't live in this conflicting world, right? I mean, we'd have conflict. Then I would have to persuade George to accommodate to me, and he'd have to persuade me to accommodate to him. And in the case, if it really gets nasty, then the only way to settle this is brute force. Okay? When you don't have a logos, now this is very important, when there's no logos, there's no convincing. There's only persuading. So, again, back to George here, if I were to try to persuade George, I would say, let me try to convince you why I am right, or why I'm not necessarily right, but why I'm abiding to a logos that is good, right, and salutary. And I would try to convince him to not necessarily win him over to me, but win him over to the thing. Okay, but if there's no objective thing, then all we're left with is persuasion and force. If there's no logos, we don't convince, we just persuade. Okay? So if there's no logos, then there's no reason for a person to strive to convince others of the logos. But this begs the question, how can a state or culture operate uniformly? Right? You can't have, now you could have Minot functioning on its independent own version of the logos, and you could have Bismarck doing the same thing, and that would be fine because you're separated by an hour and a half driving time and Lake Skakawea. So that could theoretically work in this box, and it could work in this box. But when you start mingling the two, then you have a problem. Then you have definitely a problem, okay? So, how can a state or culture operate uniformly? Certainly chaos would break out if everyone believed that his or her individual truth reigned supreme. The Sophists believed in what's called rhetoric, the principles of persuasive speech. And so instead of convincing people with the Logos, Sophists would try to persuade others or talk over people to align everyone with the community's accepted code of ethics. And so a culture's tradition is never absolute truth, but the cultural tradition is the norm for the good of the citizens at that time and place. Okay, so the tradition of the culture is that norm for that time and place. The traditions of Minot are for Minot, the traditions for Bismarck are for Bismarck, okay? Those who do not conform to the local tradition must be what? Persuaded to do so. And if they will not be persuaded to the norms and the standards of the state, well, to paraphrase Protagoras, if an individual does not share in the gifts of the gods and refuses to hearken to the state must get rid of him. That is directly from the Sophists. So, Sophism denies Logos, but does not offer solutions, okay? The fundamental problem with Sophism is that it tends to cultivate a relativist attitude. And relativism is not sustainable. That's what we have to understand. It's not sustainable. It has appeared throughout culture from time to time to wreak havoc, but only for a little while. It does its damage and then disappears. Furthermore, the evils of Sophism lies in its offering no viable solution to the problems it raises. If a sophist denies the Logos, then what? What takes its place? To quote a modern philosopher, the sophist could not offer any satisfactory intellectual solutions to the problems it raised. So what I'm saying is the sophist is going to directly be in opposition to the Heraclitus Logos. And so if you remove the Logos as the center, as we heard here, as the what? As the center unifying thing, the single world order, then what takes its place? The individual state, the individual person, the individual does. But then that only works when you can force a uniformity. But if you can't have a uniformity, chaos breaks out, and it's not sustainable. Now, the reason why we're hitting Protagoras is, and we're going to get into this later, Protagoras is definitely a reaction to Heraclitus. So we have Heraclitus, then we have a reaction to Heraclitus with Protagoras and the Sophists, and then enters the scene, stage right, we've got Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. They are reacting to who? The Sophists. They're pushing back. And we'll get into this a little bit. I'm going to paraphrase. They recognize that if this ideology of the Sophists and Protagoras, if that takes root, society cannot sustain. So they're reacting to that, rightfully so, and pulling some from Heraclitus in so doing. That makes sense?